You won't believe the madness I went through. Imagine waking up one morning to find your peaceful sanctuary, the place you've loved and cared for your entire life, slowly being ripped away from you. Not by nature, not by some unavoidable disaster, but by people who thought they could just take it. That's exactly what happened to me, and it all started with a lake. Not just any lake, but the one my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. A lake that had been in my family for generations, where I learned to fish as a boy, where my father taught me how to steer a boat, and where countless family memories were etched into the rippling waters. For years it was more than land, more than water. It was home. The mornings there were something special. I'd wake up to the sound of birds, walk down to the dock with a coffee in hand, and just watch as the sunlight shimmered across the surface of the lake. Sometimes I'd cast a line and sit quietly, feeling the stillness settle around me. Other times, I'd just close my eyes and breathe, grateful that this piece of paradise had somehow stayed untouched, while the world outside kept getting louder and busier. It was the kind of place where you felt safe, where time slowed down, and where you could imagine spending the rest of your days in peace. But peace doesn't last forever, not when greed comes knocking. Out of nowhere, the Homeowners Association, the HOA, decided my lake was no longer just mine. They had big plans that didn't involve respect or permission. One morning I heard the rumble of heavy trucks and the grinding roar of machinery echoing across the water. At first, I thought maybe it was road work or something temporary, but when I looked out across the shoreline, I nearly dropped my coffee. Bulldozers, excavators, workers in neon vests hammering in stakes, and then came the cabins. Row after row of cabins rising up like weeds. I couldn't believe my eyes. Who gave them permission to build here? Who told them they could carve up my lakefront like it was theirs to profit from? At first I tried to convince myself it was just 1 or 2 cabins, maybe a mistake, maybe even a misunderstanding. But the numbers grew fast. Dozens of cabins, then over 100. By the time I realized how far they were willing to go, there were 139 vacation cabins crowding the shores of my lake, each one slapped together like a greedy monument to everything I despised. The construction was bad enough. The endless banging, drilling and shouting filled the air day and night, drowning out the sounds of nature that once defined the place. But it was more than just noise. It was the feeling of being invaded, of watching strangers trample over land that wasn't theirs, acting like they had every right to be there. They didn't just build cabins, they brought chaos. I saw campfires spring up at night, glowing orange along the edges of the lake. People I'd never met lounged on the dock I built with my father, sipping beers like they owned it. Kids splashed and screamed in waters that had once been still and serene. My lake, my family's legacy, had become a carnival. And the HOA? They strutted around proudly, as if they'd created something incredible, as if they hadn't stolen every bit of it. At first I tried to fight the frustration, to tell myself I could learn to live with it. But the more I watched, the harder it became. Every time I saw another cabin go up, it felt like a dagger in my chest. Every time I heard a jet ski ripping across the water, leaving oil streaks in its wake, I clenched my fists. My quiet paradise was being eaten alive, and the people responsible didn't care. They weren't there to enjoy the land. They were there to squeeze money out of it, to turn my family's treasure into their business venture. What made it worse was the arrogance. The HOA members walked around like they were kings of the hill, like I was the outsider. They treated me like I should be grateful, like this circus they were creating was somehow an improvement. And all the while, I felt smaller and smaller on land that had always been mine. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to scream, to march over and start tearing down cabins with my own 2 hands. But another part of me knew something they didn't. I knew this lake wasn't what they thought it was. They thought it was untouchable, permanent, their golden ticket to profits. But I knew the truth. This lake wasn't nature's gift. It was my grandfather's creation. And every drop of water in it was being held in place by one thing, the dam. And that's when the thought first crossed my mind. If they wanted to build their empire on stolen water, maybe it was time to show them just how quickly it could all vanish. The cabins themselves were only the beginning of the nightmare. Once the HOA had its claws in the lake, they didn't just stop at building. No, they wanted control, total control. Suddenly, I was receiving letters in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo, filled with rules and demands that made my blood boil. According to them, the lake was now a shared community resource. Those were their exact words. Shared? With who? Because last time I checked, the deed to that land had my family's name on it, signed and sealed generations ago. It was my grandfather who built the dam that created the lake. It was my father who spent years maintaining the property, and it was me who had poured my heart into keeping it clean, healthy, and alive. There was nothing shared about it. But try telling that to people blinded by greed. Their arrogance knew no limits. One letter told me I couldn't run my fishing boat on the water after 8 p.m. Another claimed I needed to pay an HOA maintenance fee if I wanted to use my own dock. Imagine being told you had to pay for the right to walk out on a dock you built with your father, boards you nailed together with your own hands. They wanted me to pay to exist on my own property. The audacity was beyond belief. And then there were the new so-called community rules. No loud fishing boats, no late-night fires by the shore, no outside visitors unless they were cleared by the HOA. They even went so far as to put up signs around the lake that said private community. I laughed when I first saw them, but the more I thought about it, the more furious I became. Private community? They were acting like I was the outsider trespassing on their land. They were trying to erase me. The HOA president was the worst of them all. He strutted around in his polo shirts and expensive sunglasses like he was king of the lake. He'd give these little speeches to families staying in the cabins about how this place was going to be the next big vacation destination. He bragged about how property values would skyrocket, how the cabins would pay for themselves, how he was revitalizing the area. And every time he opened his mouth, I had to bite my tongue, because what he called revitalizing, I called destruction. They didn't care about the land. Not once did I see them take steps to protect the water or respect the wildlife. Trash piled up in places where I used to see deer grazing. Plastic bottles and food wrappers floated along the shoreline. Some nights I'd see groups leaving there, campfires still smoldering, embers glowing dangerously close to the trees. I reported it to the HOA and they brushed me off, saying, "We'll handle it." Of course, they never did. The water itself started showing signs of damage. I'd fish in the mornings and pull up plastic bags instead of bass. I saw oil slicks spreading where jet skis tore across the lake, rainbows of pollution shimmering in the sun. The fish population dwindled. Birds stopped nesting near the shore. My once pristine lake was being poisoned, and I was forced to watch as everything I loved about it withered away. What stung the most was the entitlement. The families who rented cabins walked around like they owned the place. They left beer cans on my dock. They cut across my property without asking. They shouted late into the night as if they were at a carnival instead of someone's private sanctuary. I'd confront them, tell them this was my land, and they'd laugh. The HOA said it's for everyone, they'd sneer, waving their cabin rental receipts like proof of ownership. To them, money bought entitlement. To me, it felt like theft in broad daylight. It wasn't just about the land, it was about respect. Respect for the history of the place, respect for the environment, respect for the people who built it. But respect was the one thing the HOA didn't have. They bulldozed over my rights, my family's legacy, and even nature itself, all in the name of profit. Every rule they made, every cabin they built, every trash bag they ignored, it all piled up inside me like a fire waiting to ignite. Still, I kept my patience. Maybe because deep down, I knew something they didn't. They strutted around as if their control was permanent, as if their rules meant something, as if they could rewrite history with a few sheets of paper. But they had no idea what lay beneath. The surface of the lake. They didn't know its secret. They didn't know the truth of the dam. And every time I got one of their letters, Every time I saw another beer can floating in the water, every time the HOA president smirked at me from across the shore, that secret became harder and harder to keep. I realized something important. They thought they had power, but in reality it was sitting quietly at the bottom of the valley, behind steel gates that only I controlled. They were playing checkers on a board where I was holding all the chess pieces, and sooner or later they were going to learn the hard way that you don't mess with something you don't understand. The truth about the lake was something almost nobody knew, and that's what gave me the upper hand. To the casual eye, it looked like a natural wonder, calm, deep, and timeless. Families who rented cabins assumed it had been there for centuries, carved by nature herself. But that was a lie. This lake only existed because of one man, my grandfather. Decades ago, he built a dam across a narrow river that once wound lazily through the valley. He worked with his hands, hauling stones, pouring concrete, and creating something that would hold back the water and flood the valley, giving life to the lake my family grew up around. Without that dam, the water would slip away, draining back into the river and leaving behind nothing but mud and memories. It was one of those family stories you grow up hearing, the kind that sticks with you. My grandfather was proud of it, not because he wanted to brag, but because it was proof of what determination could do. He didn't build it for profit. He built it for his family, for future generations, for the peace and beauty it brought to the land. And all his life he taught us to respect it. The dam was strong, but it was also alive in a way. It needed care. It needed attention. He showed my father how to maintain the gates, how to check for cracks, how to handle the heavy steel wheels that controlled the flow of water. And when my father passed it down to me, I felt the weight of that responsibility. It wasn't just concrete and steel. It was our heritage. But the HOA didn't know that. They thought the lake was permanent, untouchable, their golden prize. They built their cabins around it like a necklace of greed, never once questioning why the shoreline was so even, or why the water levels stayed constant, even in drought. They never asked, never cared. To them, the lake was just there, like the sun and the sky, something to exploit, not something to understand. And that ignorance was their downfall. As I watched them celebrate their so-called vacation paradise, my resentment grew. The cabins filled up quickly. Families arrived with coolers and loud music, unloading jet skis and rafts, tossing beer cans into the water like it was their personal trash bin. Kids screamed and splashed until midnight. Lights from the cabins lit up the shoreline like a carnival, and the HOA president strutted around like a showman at a circus. He bragged openly about future expansion, about turning the place into a resort destination. Hearing him talk about plans for the lake was like listening to someone plan the robbery of your house while standing in your living room. But here's what kept me calm. They didn't realize how fragile their empire was. They thought they had built something permanent, when in reality it all rested on a foundation they didn't control. I held the keys to the dam. I alone could decide whether that water stayed or flowed away. And as the weeks passed, as the noise grew louder, the trash piled higher, and the wildlife disappeared further into the woods, I knew it was only a matter of time before I acted. I started visiting the dam more often, walking down the trail early in the mornings when no one was watching. I'd stand there and listen to the water pressing against the gates, the low rumble vibrating through the steel. It was a reminder that the lake wasn't a gift of nature. It was a borrowed thing, something created and held in place by human effort. One twist of the wheels, one pull of the locks, and the water would be gone. I'd run my hands across the cold steel and think, they don't even know this exists. That thought gave me power. I imagined what would happen if I opened the gates. The cabins, which had been marketed as lakefront properties, would suddenly overlook mudflats and cracked earth. Jet skis would be stranded in muck, docks would sit high and dry, and the HOA's dream of a vacation paradise would collapse overnight. Their ignorance of the dam was the rope they had tied around their own necks, and I was the one holding the knot. Still, I hesitated. It wasn't an easy decision. This lake wasn't just water. It was memories, heritage, and years of work. My grandfather had poured his soul into building it, and my father had carried that torch with pride. Part of me felt like opening the gates would be erasing what they had created. But then I'd look at what the lake had become under the HOA's grip. A polluted, overcrowded, noisy circus that spat in the face of everything my family stood for. Was I really preserving their legacy by letting it continue? Or was I honoring them by taking it back, by letting nature reclaim what greed had stolen? That was the question I asked myself each night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the sound of jet skis buzzed in the distance. And with every day that passed, the answer grew clearer. My grandfather built the dam for family, for respect, for peace. None of those things existed anymore. The HOA had twisted his gift into something ugly. If he were alive, I knew he'd tell me exactly what to do. So I made up my mind. I would end it. I would give the land back to nature, and when the time came, I wouldn't hesitate. The morning I finally decided to act felt almost too calm, like the world itself was holding its breath. Mist clung to the surface of the water, curling up in little wisps as the sun crept over the horizon. For a moment I stood on my porch sipping coffee and tried to picture what the lake would look like by the end of the day. It was hard to imagine. This place had always been defined by its water, its stillness, its reflections. But by sundown, if I followed through, that reflection would be gone. I walked the familiar trail down to the dam with slow, steady steps, my boots crunching against the dirt. Every footfall felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying not just my own decision, but the weight of my family's history on my back. I thought of my grandfather sweating in the summer heat as he built this dam stone by stone. I thought of my father, checking the gates year after year, making sure they held strong. And now here I was, their descendant, ready to undo it all, not out of carelessness, but out of necessity. When I reached the dam, the air was cooler, damp with the spray of the water pressing against the steel gates. The sound was low, steady, almost like a growl. I set my hand on the cold metal and closed my eyes for a moment. The whole lake sat, on the other side of this barrier, waiting for one decision from me. If I opened the gates, there was no going back. I took a deep breath and began to work. The locks were stiff, rust clinging to them after years of being untouched. It took strength to turn them, but eventually the first one gave way with a sharp metallic snap. The sound echoed through the valley like a warning shot. My hands moved to the next, and then the next until the gates were free. I grabbed the heavy steel wheel and began to crank it open. At first it resisted, groaning against me as if the lake itself didn't want to let go. But then it shifted, and with a long screech the gate began to move. At first it was just a trickle, thin streams of water rushing through the gap. But within minutes the trickle grew into a torrent. The roar of escaping water filled the air, echoing off the valley walls. I stepped back, watching as the lake began to change right before my eyes. The water level dropped slowly at first, then faster as the current tore through the gates. The shoreline crept outward, exposing rocks and mud that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Fish darted frantically in the shallows, adjusting to the sudden change. By late morning, the difference was undeniable. The lake was shrinking, the waterline pulling back like a curtain being drawn. Word spread quickly. Families staying in the cabins rushed outside, shouting in confusion. Children stood on docks pointing at the disappearing water. Jet skis sat stranded, tilted awkwardly in the mud. Cabin owners scrambled, some filming on their phones, others yelling at one another as if someone could fix what was happening. The HOA president stormed down to the shore, his face red with fury. I'll never forget the moment he spotted me near the dam. He stomped toward me, shouting, "What have you done? You're destroying everything." His voice cracked with panic, but I didn't flinch. I looked him square in the eye and told him the truth. This was never yours to take. Nature is reclaiming what was stolen. He sputtered, trying to argue. But what could he say? The proof was right there behind me. The lake was vanishing, slipping away faster and faster, and there was nothing he or his HOA could do to stop it. All their cabins, all their plans, all their profits depended on water that no longer existed. By the afternoon, the transformation was astonishing. What had once been a glittering body of water was now a cracked basin of mud and stone, a stream, winding lazily through the center where the river had always flowed. Docks stood high and dry, their posts casting long shadows over empty earth. Boats and rafts lay useless in the muck, tilted like forgotten toys. The cabins, once advertised as lakefront properties, now overlooked nothing but dust and ruin. People packed their bags in a frenzy. Cars pulled away one after another, leaving behind empty cabins and a growing silence. The carnival atmosphere that had choked the lake for months vanished in a single day. And as the sun began to set, painting the bare valley in gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't easy to watch the lake go. It hurt in a way to see the water drain away after it had been part of my life for so long. But at the same time, it felt right. The HOA had taken what was never theirs, poisoned it, twisted it into something ugly. By opening those gates, I hadn't destroyed the lake, I had freed it. I had returned it to the river, to nature, to something far bigger and older than any man-made dam. And standing there on the dam, with the roar of water echoing into the distance and the cabins falling silent behind me, I knew one thing for certain: the HOA would never steal from me again. In the days that followed, chaos reigned around the cabins. What had been marketed as a dream vacation spot turned into a nightmare almost overnight. Guests who had paid for lakefront views demanded refunds, storming into the HOA office with angry voices and paperwork in hand. Families who came for boating and fishing realized there was nothing left but mud and a trickle of water winding through the valley. Cars lined up in long, dusty trails, hauling away jet skis, inflatable rafts, and coolers full of food that would never be eaten. The once busy cabins emptied out faster than they had filled. Within a week, the place was eerily silent. The HOA tried to hold things together at first. They sent out statements blaming unexpected environmental changes and promising to restore the lake. I almost laughed when I read those words. Restore the lake? They didn't even know where to begin. They didn't understand that the water had been a gift of human effort in the first place, held back by a dam they had no rights to, no control over. Without me, without my cooperation, they were powerless. Their empire was built on ignorance, and ignorance never lasts. The president of the HOA came to see me one more time, his anger replaced by desperation. He tried reasoning, offering money, even suggesting a partnership. He said things like, "Think of the opportunities, the revenue, the development this place could bring." I let him talk until he ran out of breath, then simply told him what I had told him before. It was never yours to take. There was no negotiation, no compromise. The cabins were doomed from the moment they went up, and deep down he knew. As the weeks turned into months, the cabins began to rot. Without the draw of the lake, no one wanted them. Empty wood structures stood in neat little rows, their shiny new paint fading under the sun. Weeds pushed up through the gravel paths, vines creeping along the walls. Windows cracked, decks warped, and the smell of mildew set in. What was once supposed to be a bustling vacation paradise had turned into a ghost town, an ugly scar on the land that no one wanted to claim. The HOA lost money by the truckload, and before long their big dreams collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and debt. But while the cabins decayed, something else happened. Something beautiful. Nature returned. Birds that had vanished during the noisy summers came back, filling the mornings with their calls. Deer wandered down to the riverbanks to graze on the new green growth that sprang up where the lake had once stood. Wildflowers began blooming in the exposed soil, splashes of yellow and purple and red against the brown earth. Fish swam freely in the flowing river, no longer trapped in polluted still water. Even the air smelled cleaner, fresher, as if the land itself was breathing again after months of suffocation. I would walk down to the river sometimes, standing where the shoreline used to be, and I'd just listen. The roar of jet skis was gone. The late-night shouting of tourists was gone. All that was left was the sound of running water and the wind through the trees. It felt like my family's land again, not exactly the way it had been when my grandfather built the dam, but in a way closer to how it was meant to be. The lawsuits the HOA threatened me with went nowhere. Once the truth came out, that the dam was on my property, that the lake was man-made and completely under my control, their arguments collapsed. In fact, they were the ones in violation, guilty of trespassing, illegal development, and polluting. The water. They had built their entire empire on stolen ground, and the law wasn't on their side. One by one, they faded away, their voices growing quieter until there was nothing left but silence. For me, the peace that followed was worth everything. I didn't regret opening the gates, not for a single second. The lake had served its purpose for decades, but it had been twisted into something ugly by greed. By letting it go, I hadn't destroyed my family's legacy. I had protected it. I had reminded everyone and myself that some things can't be stolen, bought, or controlled. Some things belong to the land, to time, to nature itself. Sometimes, I sit on the old dock, even though it now stretches out over dry ground instead of water. I close my eyes and remember the sound of waves against the wood, the laughter of my father, the stories my grandfather told. Those memories are still mine, untouched by the HOA's greed. They can't take that away. And when I open my eyes, I see a valley alive with green, a river flowing freely, and the promise of peace stretching into the future. The cabins may crumble, the HOA may vanish, but the land endures. And so do I.